Welcome to Global Intelligence Brief. I'm your host, and today we're examining one of the most consequential geopolitical moments of our time, the Russia-Ukraine peace process. This analysis will cut through the propaganda and mainstream narratives to present you with the intellectual truth that most media outlets deliberately avoid. We'll examine the historical context, the security dilemma at the heart of this conflict, and the genuine interest of all parties involved. The Russia-Ukraine war has now entered a critical phase where peace negotiations are intensifying under the Trump administration. To understand what's actually happening in these talks, we must first understand how we arrived at this moment. The mainstream Western narrative presents this conflict as an unprovoked Russian invasion driven by Putin's imperial ambitions. However, this narrative ignores decades of strategic decisions, broken promises, and the fundamental security concerns that rational actors would have in Russia's position. This is not to absolve Russia of responsibility for its actions, but rather to understand the structural causes that made conflict increasingly likely. The root of this conflict extends back to the end of the Cold War. In 1990, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker made a famous assurance to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Baker promised that NATO would expand not 1 inch eastward. This wasn't a casual remark. Declassified documents from the National Security Archive at George Washington University confirmed that multiple Western leaders, including German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, made similar assurances to Soviet officials. These were not informal conversations, but written commitments at the highest levels of government. The documents show that Western leaders were explicitly considering and rejecting the idea of Central and Eastern European NATO membership in 1990 and 1991. Yet what happened in the decades that followed directly contradicted these assurances. NATO expanded eastward in waves: Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1999, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia in 2004. Each expansion brought NATO closer to Russia's borders. By 2008, at the Bucharest summit, NATO made an even more provocative move. It pledged that Georgia and Ukraine would eventually become NATO members. This was not a defensive measure. It was an explicit strategy to bring Russia's most strategically important neighbors into a military alliance led by the United States. For Russia, this was not a security enhancement for Eastern Europe. It was an encirclement strategy. To understand Russia's perspective, we must apply the concept of the security dilemma, a fundamental principle in international relations theory. The security dilemma occurs when one state's defensive actions are perceived as offensive threats by another state, creating a spiral of mutual suspicion and escalation. When NATO expanded eastward, it claimed this was purely defensive, protecting Eastern European states from Russian aggression. However, from Russia's perspective, NATO expansion looked exactly like what it would look like if Russia were encircling the United States with military alliances. Imagine if Russia and China had military bases throughout Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and were moving to establish bases in Canada. The United States would view this as an existential threat, not a defensive measure. Yet the US government and NATO have been unable or unwilling to acknowledge that Russia has legitimate security concerns about NATO expansion. Professor John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, one of the world's leading international relations scholars, has argued extensively that NATO expansion is the primary cause of the Ukraine conflict. Mearsheimer is not a Putin apologist. He is a realist scholar who applies the same analytical framework to all great powers. His argument is straightforward. The United States pursued a strategy to move Ukraine out of Russia's sphere of influence and integrate it into the Western alliance system. This strategy was rational from a Western perspective. It would expand Western influence and reduce Russian power. However, it was also rational for Russia to resist this strategy because allowing Ukraine to join NATO would place a hostile military alliance on Russia's border with the capability to threaten Russian territory. Mearsheimer has documented how Russian leaders, from Yeltsin through Putin, consistently and clearly opposed NATO enlargement. This was not a secret. Russian officials stated this position publicly and repeatedly. Yet Western policymakers largely dismissed these concerns as bluster or imperial nostalgia. This was a profound miscalculation. When you tell a great power that you are going to do something it has explicitly warned you against, and you do it anyway, you should not be surprised when that power takes action to defend its interests. Jeffrey Sachs, the renowned economist and foreign policy expert from Columbia University, has provided additional crucial context. Sachs points out that from Ukraine's independence in 1991 until the US backed overthrow of Ukraine's elected government in 2014, Russia showed no interest in annexing Ukrainian territory. This is a crucial historical fact that contradicts the narrative that Russia has always sought to dominate Ukraine. Russia respected Finland's neutrality for decades without threatening it. Russia respected Austria's neutrality during the Cold War without invading. The pattern is clear. Russia respects neutrality but opposes NATO expansion. What changed in 2014? The Euromaidan protests in Ukraine, which began as demonstrations against corruption, were transformed into a geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West. The US and European Union actively supported the protesters and opposed the elected pro-Russian president. When the government fell, Russia took action. It annexed Crimea, a peninsula that had been part of Russia until 1954, and hosts Russia's only warm-water naval base, a strategic asset Russia has maintained since 1783. Russia also supported separatists in the Donbas region, which is ethnically Russian and had voted overwhelmingly against Ukrainian independence in 1991. This is not to justify a Russian military intervention. International law prohibits it, but it is to explain it. Russia saw Ukraine slipping away into the Western orbit and took military action to prevent this outcome. Sachs argues, and the evidence supports, that this outcome was preventable. If the West had committed to Ukrainian neutrality, a status similar to Finland or Austria, the war would not have occurred. In late 2021, Putin made one final diplomatic attempt. Russia presented a draft US-NATO security agreement that proposed an end to NATO enlargement and removal of US missiles from Eastern Europe. This was not an unreasonable proposal. It addressed Russia's core security concerns. The Biden administration flatly rejected it without serious negotiation. This rejection was a critical moment. It signaled to Russia that diplomacy would not resolve the NATO expansion issue and that military action might be the only option. Now we arrive at the current peace process. The Trump administration has proposed a 28-point peace plan that includes territorial concessions by Ukraine, restrictions on NATO membership, and international security guarantees. Russia has indicated it agrees in principle with this framework. However, Europe and Ukraine have pushed back, wanting stronger security guarantees and opposing permanent territorial losses. This creates a fundamental tension in the negotiations. The European position reflects a different strategic calculation than Russia's. European leaders fear that if Ukraine loses territory and NATO membership is restricted, Russia will have succeeded in using military force to achieve its objectives. This would set a precedent that great powers can use military force to redraw borders and prevent smaller countries from joining alliances. From a European perspective, this threatens the entire post-Cold War international order. However, from Russia's perspective, the current international order is precisely the problem. It allows NATO to expand to Russia's borders while Russia has no say in the matter. NATO itself has been largely sidelined from these negotiations. The Trump administration is negotiating directly with Russia and Ukraine, with European input, but not NATO leadership. This reflects a fundamental shift in US strategy. The Trump administration views NATO as a burden rather than an asset, and it is willing to negotiate a settlement that reduces NATO's role in European security. This is a dramatic change from the Biden administration, which sought to strengthen NATO and expand its role. The current battlefield situation provides context for these negotiations. According to military analysts, including the Military Summary Channel, Russia has made significant territorial gains in recent months. Ukrainian forces have been pushed back in several sectors, particularly in the Donbas region. The city of Pokrovsk, a major Ukrainian logistics hub, is increasingly threatened by Russian advances. Ukrainian military resources are stretched thin, and the country faces a manpower shortage. Meanwhile, Russia has mobilized its economy for sustained warfare and has access to significant reserves of manpower and equipment. This military situation affects the negotiating dynamics. Ukraine's leverage in negotiations is declining as Russia makes territorial gains. Trump is using this military reality to pressure Zelensky to accept a negotiated settlement. Trump has given Ukraine days to respond to the peace plan, warning that if Ukraine rejects it, the US may reduce military aid. This is a significant shift from Biden's approach of providing unlimited support to Ukraine regardless of Ukraine's negotiating position. The peace plan being discussed includes several key elements. First, Ukraine would accept current territorial losses. Crimea and portions of the Donbas would remain under Russian control. Second, Ukraine would commit to neutrality and would not join NATO. Third, Ukraine would receive international security guarantees, possibly including guarantees from the US, European countries, and potentially even Russia. Fourth, Ukraine would be allowed to join the European Union but not NATO. Fifth, Ukraine would agree to limits on its military capabilities to prevent future threats to Russia. From Russia's perspective, this plan addresses its core security concerns. NATO expansion to Ukraine would be prevented, and Ukraine would be neutralized. Russia would retain the territories it has conquered, which it views as historically Russian and strategically important. The plan is consistent with what Russia has been demanding throughout the conflict. However, from Ukraine's perspective, this plan represents a defeat. Ukraine would lose territory, abandon hopes of NATO membership, and accept permanent restrictions on its military. For Zelensky and the Ukrainian government, accepting this plan means accepting that Ukraine cannot join the Western alliance and must maintain a precarious neutrality between Russia and the West. This is a difficult pill to swallow for a government that has fought for 3 years to resist Russian domination. Europe's position is more nuanced. European leaders want Ukraine to survive as an independent state and to have a path toward NATO membership in the future. They also want to maintain the principle that countries have the right to choose their own alliances. However, European countries also recognize that they cannot sustain indefinite military support to Ukraine, and that a negotiated settlement is preferable to endless war. The European counterproposal seeks to balance these concerns by proposing stronger security guarantees for Ukraine, while leaving open the possibility of future NATO membership. The fundamental issue at the heart of these negotiations is the security dilemma. Russia demands that Ukraine not join NATO because NATO membership would place a hostile military alliance on Russia's border. The West argues that countries have the right to choose their own alliances and that NATO is a defensive alliance that poses no threat to Russia. These positions are logically incompatible. One side must give way, or a compromise must be found. The most likely compromise is some form of phased NATO integration. Ukraine might receive security guarantees that provide immediate protection, while NATO membership is deferred to some future date when Russia's security concerns have been addressed. This would allow Ukraine to maintain the possibility of NATO membership while respecting Russia's current security concerns. However, such an arrangement would require Russia to trust that NATO would not expand to Ukraine in the future, and it would require the West to commit to not expanding NATO without Russian agreement. Another possible outcome is a frozen conflict. Ukraine would accept current territorial losses and commit to neutrality, but would not receive full security guarantees. Instead, there would be a ceasefire monitored by international observers, similar to the situation in Korea or Cyprus. This would end the active fighting but would leave the underlying conflict unresolved. Russia would have achieved its primary objective of preventing NATO expansion, but Ukraine would remain vulnerable to future Russian pressure. This outcome would be unstable and could lead to renewed conflict if circumstances change. A third possibility is that negotiations fail and the war continues. This would be the worst outcome for Ukraine, which would continue to lose territory and manpower. It would also be costly for Russia, which would face continued international sanctions and economic isolation. However, if Trump loses political will for a settlement or if Ukraine refuses to negotiate seriously, this outcome remains possible. To understand what a fair and sustainable peace deal would look like, we must address the underlying causes of the conflict. The security dilemma cannot be resolved through military victory. It can only be resolved through mutual reassurance and commitment to a new security architecture. This would require several elements. First, the West must acknowledge that NATO expansion has been a source of legitimate Russian security concerns. This does not mean that NATO was wrong to expand. It means that the expansion created tensions that should have been managed more carefully. The West should commit to not expanding NATO further to countries that border Russia without Russian agreement. This would mean that Ukraine and Georgia would not join NATO, at least not in the foreseeable future. Second, Russia must commit to respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and other neighboring countries. This means accepting that Ukraine has the right to choose its own government and to maintain democratic institutions. It also means committing to not using military force to change borders or overthrow governments. Third, an international security architecture must be created that provides security for Ukraine and other Eastern European countries without relying on NATO expansion. This could include security guarantees from major powers, including the US, Europe, and potentially Russia itself. It could also include confidence-building measures such as military-to-military communication channels, joint exercises, and limits on military deployments near borders. Fourth, the underlying historical grievances must be addressed. Russia feels that it was betrayed by NATO expansion and that the West has sought to encircle and dominate it. The West feels that Russia has sought to dominate its neighbors and that NATO expansion was necessary to protect Eastern European countries. These grievances are real and deeply felt. A sustainable peace must address them through dialogue and mutual understanding. The role of China in this conflict is also important to understand. China has maintained a position of strategic ambiguity, neither supporting Russia nor the West. However, China has made clear that it views the conflict as a consequence of Western expansion and NATO aggression. China's position is that the US and NATO should respect Russia's security concerns and should not expand further. This position reflects China's own concerns about US military expansion in Asia. China views the Ukraine conflict as a precedent for how the US might respond to Chinese actions in Taiwan or the South China Sea. The economic implications of this conflict are enormous. Ukraine's economy has been devastated by the war. Reconstruction will cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Global food security has been threatened by the disruption of Ukrainian grain exports. Energy prices have risen due to sanctions on Russian oil and gas. The global economy has been destabilized by the conflict and the sanctions imposed on Russia. A sustainable peace would need to address these economic issues and create a framework for reconstruction and economic cooperation. The international legal implications are also significant. Russia's invasion of Ukraine violated the UN Charter and international law. However, the West's expansion of NATO also violated the spirit of agreements made with Russia at the end of the Cold War. International law is not being applied equally. The West has violated international law in numerous cases. Iraq, Libya, Syria, without facing the same consequences that Russia faces. A sustainable peace must address these double standards and create a more consistent application of international law. Looking forward, the most likely outcome is some form of negotiated settlement that includes Ukrainian neutrality, territorial concessions, and international security guarantees. This settlement will not satisfy all parties. Ukraine will feel it has lost too much, Russia will feel it could have achieved more, and Europe will worry about future Russian aggression. However, it will likely be preferable to continued warfare that destroys Ukraine and destabilizes Europe. The critical question is whether this settlement will be durable or whether it will be merely a pause in the conflict. History suggests that settlements that ignore underlying causes tend to be temporary. The Treaty of Versailles after World War I created resentment that led to World War II. A sustainable peace in Ukraine must address the security dilemma and create a framework for long-term stability. The stakes of this conflict are enormous. The outcome will determine whether international law matters, whether great powers can use military force to redraw borders, and whether smaller countries have genuine sovereignty. It will also determine the future of NATO, the future of European security, and the future of the international order. The decisions made in the coming weeks and months will have consequences for decades to come. What we are witnessing is a fundamental challenge to the post-Cold War international order. Russia is rejecting the idea that NATO can expand to its borders without its consent. The West is defending the principle that countries have the right to choose their own alliances. These principles are in direct conflict and one of them will have to give way. The peace process is an attempt to find a compromise that both sides can live with. The intellectual truth that mainstream media avoids is this: both sides have legitimate grievances and legitimate security concerns. The conflict did not arise from pure Russian aggression or pure Western naivety. It arose from a clash of great power interests and a failure of diplomacy. A sustainable peace requires acknowledging this reality and creating a new security architecture that addresses the concerns of all parties. The role of the Trump administration in this process is crucial. Trump has shown willingness to pressure both Russia and Ukraine to accept a negotiated settlement. He has also shown willingness to reduce U.S. commitment to NATO and to prioritize American interests over alliance commitments. This represents a fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy that will have long-term consequences. Europe's role is also critical. European countries must decide whether they are willing to accept Ukrainian neutrality and territorial losses in exchange for peace. They must also decide whether they are willing to reduce their reliance on U.S. security guarantees and to develop a more independent European security architecture. This is a difficult choice that will have profound implications for European unity and European power. The fundamental lesson from this conflict is that security dilemmas are difficult to resolve through military means. Once a spiral of mutual suspicion and escalation begins, it is difficult to stop. The only way to resolve a security dilemma is through dialogue, mutual reassurance, and commitment to a new framework for security. This requires leadership, wisdom, and a willingness to acknowledge the legitimate concerns of all parties. The peace process currently underway represents an opportunity to resolve this conflict and to create a new security architecture for Europe. However, it also represents a test of whether the international community can learn from past mistakes and create a more stable and just international order. The decisions made in the coming weeks will determine whether this opportunity is seized or squandered. As you follow these developments, I encourage you to think critically about the narratives being presented to you. Mainstream media tends to present simplified narratives that support particular political positions. The truth is more complex. Both Russia and the West have pursued rational strategies based on their perceived interests. The conflict arose from a clash of these interests and a failure of diplomacy. A sustainable peace requires acknowledging this complexity and working toward a solution that addresses the legitimate concerns of all parties. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is not simply a story of good versus evil. It is a story of great power competition, security dilemmas, and the difficulty of creating a stable international order. Understanding this complexity is essential for understanding the peace process and for understanding the future of international relations. Thank you for watching Global Intelligence Brief. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to Bonnie's Life and enable notifications so you don't miss future episodes. We are committed to providing intellectual, fact-based analysis that cuts through mainstream narratives and presents you with the truth. Join our community of critical thinkers who are committed to understanding the world as it actually is, not as politicians and media outlets want us to believe it is.